As I continue with this podcast, I want to do special series episodes once in a while on topics ranging from the greatest winning stocks in history to the best short squeezes to lessons from great traders of the past. Today, I want to kick off a series on the biggest fat pitch stock setups in history. These are the biggest, most obvious layups that a trader could hope to find in the market. And I want to stress the point of this series in going over these obvious, easy trades through history. The goal is to give you examples of what a glaringly obvious 10 out of 10 stock looks like as it is unfolding, without us just hindsight trading the chart. We're going to look at the market environment at the time and what factors would have led you to choose this particular stock as a prime trading candidate. By seeing the background to previous markets and the stories around these stocks, you can hopefully use them to draw on similarities to stocks you see in the current market or the market that you'll see in the future. The characteristics that made up a great stock 150 years ago are exactly the same characteristics that make up a great stock today. These qualities are a feature of the market structure that aren't going to go away anytime soon. Understanding what these stocks look like as they're being made is a true edge in the market. In this episode, we're going to discuss the market background that this stock was trading in, its industry, what they made and sold, and any information that I could find on their fundamentals, such as sales and earnings growth, any relevant news on the company, and how the market and other individual stocks at the time were playing out, as well as showing you the chart and the breakouts that it made. And I can't claim to have seen every stock move in history, but I've definitely seen a lot of them. In every bull market, you will get at least one pretty obvious fat pitch stock to trade. But this one in particular stands out as a top 5 contender for the most obvious fattest pitch trade in history. And we are talking about Wright Aeronautical from 1927 to 1929. But to really understand what it would have been like to be a trader at this time, we first need to travel back through history to understand the time period and how Wright Aeronautical fit into the market ecosystem. People had been trying to devise various types of flying machines for well over 1,000 years. Then, in late 1903, the Wright brothers finally solved the problem of motorized flight. From there, it wasn't until the mid to late 1910s that planes were used for transporting passengers and mail. And the use of planes was still not very widespread at all. It wasn't until 1925 that the U.S. government began issuing contracts for air mail services. That's over 20 years after the Wright brothers' first flight. The aviation industry was still in its infancy. Then, in 1919, a hotel owner named Raymond Ortigue announced an offer of $25,000, which is about $500,000 today, adjusted for inflation, to the first aviator from an allied nation who could fly nonstop across the Atlantic Ocean from New York to Paris, or vice versa. And by 1927, no one had been able to complete the flight to win the Ortigue Prize. 6 men had died attempting to win it, and several others were injured. But by this time, aviation had come a long way since the prize was first offered 8 years prior. The desire to win it sparked a great deal of investment into improving airplanes. This was the year when some real serious contenders for the prize appeared. And it's important to note that these events in aviation and others were a big curiosity to the public, and they were printed frequently in the newspaper, often as front page news. There were many aviation records set and broken in 1927, and among those were the longest time in the air, the longest flight distance, the longest over water flight, and many more. They all occurred in 1927, but nothing was able to compare to the winning of the Ortigue Prize by the then unknown flyer Charles Lindbergh. This was the ChatGPT moment for aviation. In May of 1927, when Lindbergh made his epochal flight, he was just one of two official contestants. In May 1927, when Lindbergh made his epochal flight, he was just one of two official contestants vying for the prize. And to say that his landing in Paris was big news would be a massive understatement. He instantly became the most famous person in the world, without a doubt, the most famous person. He was awarded the Medal of Honor, and by the French, he was given the French Legion of Honor Medal. 1 out of every 4 Americans traveled to see him on his tour around the country after he returned from France. And the stock market and banks even closed for a national day of celebration to mark his achievement. He was, without a doubt, the most famous person on Earth at this time. He was welcomed as a national hero in every single country that he visited. His plane, named the Spirit of St. Louis, was a custom-built plane by the Wright Aeronautical Company. The company was very small and not publicly traded. However, the engine that Lindbergh wanted this plane to be built in mind with was manufactured by Wright Aeronautical, which just so happened to be listed on the New York Stock Exchange. And as you might have guessed from its name, Wright Aeronautical was the successor to the original Wright company created by the Wright brothers in 1909. What's more is that the engines used by at least 3 other famous pilots of the time, including Amelia Earhart, were also manufactured by Wright Aeronautical. The flights and actions of these other flyers were often front-page news as aviation fever gripped the world. In the months following Lindbergh's flight, some 40 pilots attempted other long-distance transoceanic flights, 21 of whom, that's over half of them, ended up dying during their attempts. Lindbergh's flight ignited interest in the entire aviation sector. The number of transoceanic flights skyrocketed. Lindbergh's flight ignited major interest in the entire aviation sector. The number of transatlantic flight attempts skyrocketed. Public and private investment surged. Government contracts, aviation prizes, and proposals for major air infrastructure all supported the boom. The New York Stock Exchange began listing more aviation companies, including Curtiss Airplane, which was previously traded on the smaller New York Curb Exchange. Throughout 1928 and 1929, many more aviation stocks came to the market, such as Boeing, which later became United Aircraft, the Aviation Corporation of America, Fokker Aircraft, Curtiss Flying Services, Douglas Aircraft, Keystone Aircraft, Sikorsky Aviation, and many others. A major supplier of car parts to General Motors even renamed itself from the Bendix Corporation to Bendix Aviation. By 1928, it was claimed commercial aviation could cut cross-country travel time by more than 50% compared to trains. Rail companies began to invest heavily in the industry. Airmail expanded and international airlines formed. The New York Times even began dedicating an entire page to news in the field of aviation. Aviation was one of the hottest topics of interest among the public. All of this attention resulted in calls for more regulations in the aviation industry and attracted massive investment inflows to create viable passenger and freight airlines to commercialize the industry the way that the automobile industry developed a decade prior. The New York Times even began dedicating an entire page to news in the field of aviation. Aviation was one of the hottest topics of interest among the public. All of this attention resulted in calls for more regulations in the aviation industry and attracted massive investment inflows to create viable passenger and freight airlines to commercialize the industry the way that the automobile industry developed a decade prior. It's important to understand just how you, as a trader in 1927, would have been able to capitalize on all of this information. You would have seen all the stories in the newspaper, and obviously you would know about Lindbergh's flight. But unless you were trading on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange the day of his flight, It is very unlikely that you would have been able to get in on day one. Wright was a very thinly traded stock before May 1927, but it jumped nearly 40% from its close before Lindbergh's successful flight to the day after he landed in Paris. Liquidity also poured in. The day before the announcement of Lindbergh's flight, it traded only $11,000. The day after his flight, it traded over $400,000. And then the next day, traded over $1 million. To put this in perspective, according to the IRS, the average annual salary in 1925 was $5,000. Although this figure seems to be about double what I've seen other sources say, and the wealth of the top earners of the country at the time may have skewed this number, I've seen sources that claim that the real figure was between $1,500 and $2,000 a year. And as I said earlier, Lindbergh was the most famous person on Earth as of late May 1927. Many other pilots were featured on the front page of newspapers across the country as well. Lindbergh's flight sparked massive interest and investment in the aviation field. In the months and years after his flight, Lindbergh toured the country in the interest of promoting the commercial aviation industry. Also promoting the industry was Will Rogers, who was one of the most famous actors in the country at the time. He had a column in the New York Times that reached supposedly 40 million people daily. He urged regulation and investment in the industry to compete with other nations that he saw as having a more built-up aviation industry, specifically in Europe. The New York Times also had a column specifically dedicated to aviation beginning in 1927. Aviation was a big deal in this year. To show you an example of what was being talked about in the newspapers, here is an article from the New York Times in August of 1927. So I'll go ahead and read a little bit about this article right here. It is titled "The Boom in Aviation." It did not need the success of 2 new transatlantic flyers or the suspense over the fate of the one who undertook to fly straight to Brazil from Georgia to prove the keen and growing public interest in the conquest of the air. Progress of commercial aviation is no longer to be measured by carriage of mails and the casual use of airplanes by adventurous businessmen. A rapidly increasing number of people are taking whatever risks there are in air travel. All over the United States, aviators who take patrons up for a ride for $5 are making money out of their enterprise. Accidents are few. The whir of propellers is getting to be a common sound. You come across such items as this. Harry Herman of the Springfield Airlines flew 2 passengers to New York for the Dempsey-Sharkey fight. And then it lists a paragraph given from an issue of a magazine at the time called Aviation. And it reads as follows. At the public hearings on Massachusetts airports at the State House recently, 22 towns were represented and urged in almost every case that the state create a Department of Aviation, that towns be allowed to spend money on airports even outside their city limits, and that taxes be abated or canceled on airport land. At the Lake Geneva, Wisconsin and Water Regatta, which began on July 28th, 50 planes were in the air on the opening day. In 2 years, the Ford Motor Company scheduled 2,874 trips and completed 2,783. The miles flown were 507,670. The freight carried 3,062,044 pounds. New airways companies are being incorporated all over the country. When Maitland Field, Milwaukee, was dedicated recently by Lieutenants Maitland and Hegenberger, I don't know what his name is, 150,000 people lined Wisconsin Avenue to get a glimpse of those aviators. Businessmen are buying airplanes for their own use. There's a group of 9 in Detroit who are known locally as the Wise Birds. It is hard to keep track of the cities that offer prizes for long-distance flights. The demand for aviators is not greater than the supply. Air derbies are the order of the day. round-the-world flights are planned in several countries. Announcement is made that the West Indian Aerial Express of Santo Domingo will make an opening flight on October 1st. It promises to operate a passenger, freight, and mail service to Havana and Trinidad. Henry Ford, who has put more people into automobiles than any other manufacturer, is building a metal plane, not only for passenger service by airlines, but for private use, with Colonel Lindbergh touring the country in the interest of commercial aviation. Flying is bound to become more and more popular. So obviously you can see all the hype that was surrounding aviation at this time, shortly after Lindbergh's initial flight. All of this interest in aviation may have played a role in reawakening the animal spirits in the market, as the Dow Jones Industrial Average didn't emerge from its correction or its consolidation until sometime after Lindbergh's flight, actually right about the time of Lindbergh's flight. In addition to Wright, there were maybe only one or two other aviation stocks available to trade in 1927. And Wright Aeronautical was the only one listed on the New York Stock Exchange on the day of Lindbergh's flight, as well as being the most liquid of the group. This, along with the fact that the engines found in the planes of all of the famous pilots were made by Wright. And that should have led you to pick this as the obvious group leader. So imagine yourself as a trader in August of 1927. The market looks to be at a potential turning point technically, coming out of a year-long consolidation. And three of the most important market leaders, General Motors, General Electric, and U.S. Steel, are right now trading at all-time highs. The current bull market has been going on since about 1924, with a minor pause in 1926. GM is up about 30% from its prior breakout at the beginning of March. General Electric is up about 20 to 30% in the same period, and U.S. Steel just broke out a couple weeks before. Just 3 months ago, the most insanely publicized event in your entire lifetime happened when Lindbergh completed his flight to Paris, making him the most famous person on Earth. 25% of the nation's population traveled to see him on his national tour. Another incredibly famous pilot was greeted in France as a national hero for his recent crossing of the Atlantic, and then received a similar greeting on his return to New York. News on the aviation industry is in the front page of the papers on a regular basis. 2 months ago, the stock market had a special holiday in which it shut down in order to celebrate Lindbergh. There's an entire page in the New York Times dedicated to aviation. Lindbergh and others are pushing for regulation and big investment into the industry. And at top of all of that, the only pure play aviation stock listed on the New York Stock Exchange just so happens to be the company that made the engine for Lindbergh and every single one of the other famous pilots. And this stock is up about 90% from its year-to-date low on elevated volume and has been trading in a tight range base for the past 2 months. And within the last 2 weeks, they reported profits up 85%. And the floor traders on the New York Stock Exchange all refer to shares of Wright Aero as Lindbergh's. It really does not get much more obvious than this. If you bought it on the breakout, you would have been up about 50% in the following 2 weeks. During that time, the American Rail Express Company announced a transcontinental air package service. The railroads considered using planes to aid in the transportation of goods. The company announced that it would need about 75 planes with an investment of $1.5 million. The New York Times article announcing the news also says that Wall Street is anticipating a wave of investment into the aviation industry similar to that seen in the automobile group during the First World War, about a decade before. Similarly to the aviation industry at this time, the nascent automobile industry in the 1910s was not yet much of economic importance. Then, after the outbreak of the First World War, there was a massive wave of investment into the industry as it proved to be an invaluable mode of transporting goods and people during the war. It was also during this period of heavy investment that the industry began to mature and become much more important in the American economy. After trading up to $60 per share, Wright Aeronautical entered another base building period for about 10 more weeks. During this time, there were still daily mentions of the progress and news in aviation made in the New York Times and other newspapers. The U.S. Army announced an air laboratory to emphasize further expansion of the government's effort to improve efficiency of airplane motors and perfect air navigation and equipment. Daniel Guggenheim, a mining magnate and philanthropist, created a fund for the promotion of aviation. The fund offered a $150,000, roughly $3 million today, adjusted for inflation, prize to the winner of a competition to create new, safe aircrafts. This spurred more investment into making airplanes safer and more practical for commercial uses. In October, it was announced that the New York Stock Exchange would list the shares of Curtiss Airplane Motor Company, making it only the second pure-play aviation stock to be listed on the New York Stock Exchange. Previously, it had been traded on the smaller Curb Exchange, which later became the American Exchange, where it shot up to over $45 from a low of $19 on the year. Wright Aeronautical announced profits for the third quarter were up 125% year over year. 2 weeks later, the Navy announced the company won a contract to produce 156 aircraft engines and spare parts for $878,000. Lindbergh received the Hubbard Medal from President Calvin Coolidge. And the Hubbard Medal is the National Geographic Society's highest honor, which goes to individuals for exceptional contributions in exploration and scientific research and discovery. The largest plane in the world was constructed in England. Wright Aeronautical announced manufacturing licensing agreements in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and negotiations for a similar deal in France as their motors were gaining prestige in Europe. The CEO said that he saw increasing earnings for full year 1927 and much better results for 1928. He also suggested that the annual dividend could be increased. The company expanded manufacturing capacity and said less than 1/3 of its business was now going to the government, showing an increase in the commercial side of its business. As the stock then broke above the $60 top of its base, it made another quick move up about 50% to nearly $100 before then pulling back into another basing period. Over the next 2 to 3 months, the market remained in a solid bull trend as speculation increased and many new issues began to come to the market throughout 1928. Plans for 6 airports to be built in the New York area were suggested. Lindbergh was named as the first Times Man of the Year. Pan American Airways and Air Mail Company planned expansion into Central and South America. An International Civil Aviation Congress was suggested by President Coolidge to honor the 25th anniversary of the Wright brothers' first flight. And the company secured a Navy contract for 100 engines worth about $1.15 million. They doubled the rate of their dividend. A large aircraft show was announced for the second week in April in Detroit. Earnings for 1927 were up 33% and sales were up 26%. There were 2 breakout points that you could have bought here. And keep in mind that not only did GM break out a couple weeks before, but RCA exploded past 100 for the first time and became the absolute favored speculative leader on extremely heavy volume. And this move really sparked the bubble in the late 1920s. So this is when things really started to get hot in the market. The action in RCA sparked a rush of euphoria throughout the market as stocks began to rally on very heavy volume. The animal spirits were very much alive before Wright Aeronautical made its move. In just 5 days, it shot up nearly 60% on heavy volume before building a high tight flag, giving another chance to buy. During this short consolidation, the company announced plans to expand its manufacturing capabilities and to grow its workforce by 67% in order to keep up with the growing demand. This next breakout soared about 90% over 2 weeks. Had you bought in the big base breakout over $45, you would have made about 170% on the trade at its peak. All those gains happened in just about 6 weeks. Here's an excerpt from an article on the day Wright Aeronautical broke out above the $90 mark. Resumption of speculation for the rise in stocks, with a violence of movement and magnitude of transactions close to the pace pursued before the advance was checked on Tuesday, did not render the course of yesterday's market essentially different from the usual action after the first interruption to such speculation in its heights. The psychology of the movement is evident enough. For one day, Wall Street fears that the final reckoning has arrived. The speculator hesitates. Precautionary sales increase and prices yield irregularly, though with smaller losses. A few more days, and the fact that some of the highly manipulated shares have begun to rise again revives the excitement of the speculative following. Such a day as yesterday ensues. In most of the famous speculative crazes, this return of the market to its former attitude has increased the public's faith in unlimited further rise of values, and it seemed to do so yesterday. It was clear enough from the action of radio stock, however, that the day's movement was not spontaneous. The advancing of this one stock several points in the opening transaction, followed by a further rise, which left it at the close 24.5 points higher than on the day before. 45 points above the price of a week ago, and more than 100% above that of the end of February, sufficiently indicated the character of the market. Other stocks followed with less sensational demonstrations, but with advances which would themselves have been considered extravagant not very long ago. Half a dozen stocks were bid up 9 to 17 points, most of them closing at the highest. And although the highly spectacular movements occurred, as they always do, in a relatively small group of stocks, a considerable part of the general market showed signs of being swept from conservative moorings. And as you could tell from the article, it mentioned that RCA had increased over 100% from its breakout at the end of February. And that article was from March 31st, 1928. So you can see in just a month, RCA was up over 100%. At the end of its upward run, Wright Aeronautical entered into a partnership with Curtiss Airplane and two of the largest railroad companies in a joint venture to cut coast-to-coast travel time to just 48 hours. The news was on the front page of the New York Times, and the founder worked with Lindbergh to create the air routes. The venture, Transcontinental Air Transport, later became Trans World Airlines, better known as TWA, after a merger in 1930. Wright Aero then entered its final viable base before the 1929 crash. The base took over 6 months to build out. Throughout the rest of the year, the market remained hot with other stocks making moves, while most of the bigger market leaders grinded out their last base or two. At this point, the liquidity of Wright Aeronautical in its basing period was very significant. It was not even close to the level of a General Motors or RCA, but it was still a very deeply liquid stock over the next several months. Earnings grew over 200% during this time as well. At this time, you also had a boom in IPOs, and many of these stocks were related to aviation. Some of the companies that I mentioned in the previous section were coming to market around this time. So this would have been, between May, October-ish, May and October, November of 1928. The final breakout happened the day before the results of the 1928 presidential election were announced. It then gapped up on news that the business-friendly Herbert Hoover had won the election. Wright Aeronautical went straight up 75% in about 3 weeks before it, along with many of the other former leaders, fell and never quite regained their high levels. Basically, after building out another base, they just kind of grinded up around their highs, but never really made much of a good move after that. Although there were many new airplane stocks that came into the market during this period in 1928 and 1929, which made decent runs, Wright Aero never really made another good move and became seriously choppy after this final breakout. And then also in 1929, as it's grinding out its final big base before the big crash, it ended up ceasing to be traded as Wright Aeronautical, as it ended up merging with Curtiss Airplane and Motor to become Curtiss Wright, which is still listed on the New York Stock Exchange today as ticker symbol CW. And in review, it may have been understandable if you did not catch the first base breakout over $40, since Wright Aeronautical wasn't super liquid, but was definitely liquid enough to have caught. But given the circumstances, it was still a very obvious play even at that time. I studied many of the market's greatest winning stocks over the last 150 years, and I don't really believe that there are many more obvious softball, fat pitch stocks that you could ever trade through history than Wright Aeronautical. Really, it's the story of Lindbergh that lends to the obviousness of this play, just how incredibly famous he was at the time, and the fact that Wright Aeronautical was the only pure play aviation stock at a time when aviation fever gripped the nation, and they were also the manufacturers of the motor, the engine that was used in Lindbergh's plane, as well as the planes of many of the other flyers at the time. Wright Aeronautical's story was a 10 out of 10. The growth was solid. The news flow was great. Liquidity on it was great. The market environment was absolutely as good as it gets. I mean, you're talking about like literally 1929 stock market bubble insanity. And the theme and technical setups were nearly perfect. The biggest tell to pay attention to on Wright Aeronautical was definitely the story around Lindbergh and the aviation industry as a whole at the time. Wright Aero's connection to Lindbergh and that of nearly all the other famous pilots of the era lended a great deal of credibility to Wright as a viable stock selection. Its recently created air-cooled engines were a favorite of most of the advanced flyers of the time and played a significant role in helping Lindbergh to complete his flight. The massive level of public investment in aviation from this point onwards only helped to enhance the story around Wright Aero. And good stories can be a big factor in a stock's advance or decline. There are countless examples of stories alone being enough to push stocks to incredible heights. Not only did you have a great story here, but you also had great earnings and sales growth to go along with it. Due to all the hype around aviation, Wright Aero saw orders of its engines grow at a steady pace. Earnings accelerated from high 20 or low 30% in 1927 to 200% by the end of 1928. They reported several large orders from the government and were able to grow the commercial side of their business as more plane companies began to pop up and interest in commercial aviation began to take over the country. Although it wasn't a highly liquid stock during some of its basing periods, when it broke out, it was very liquid. The stock was much thinner prior to Lindbergh's flight, as you can see on the chart. The sustained increase in liquidity was another big tip-off that it was garnering a lot of attention, never mind the rise in its price. The market at the time had been in a raging bull for the previous 3 years. Although the market went through a shallow consolidation in 1926, it began to emerge from its consolidation right around the time of Lindbergh's flight. So you had a super strong market emerging from a year-long consolidation at a time when the most globally celebrated and publicized event in your entire lifetime, had you been alive back then, was occurring. And that event was focused on a technology that was directly built by the only aviation stock listed on the New York Stock Exchange. GM, X, and GE were all market leaders at the time, and they were all trading at or just around all-time highs. So although the market was just emerging out of a correction, there were three important, highly liquid stocks that were both trading at high prices at the same time that Wright was making its initial pop. On top of all of that, the technical setups for those of you that trade technicals were all grade A textbook, perfect long base breakouts with a nice short flag setup on it as well. When Wright Arrow had a breakout, every single time it made a quick and clean move to new high ground with excellent follow through. The lowest percent gain from entry to peak would have been about 50% among the 5 successful breakouts that it had, and it likely would have enticed you to buy a few of those false breakouts along the way, as many stocks do, but you would have been well compensated for the successful ones that you managed to catch. And that concludes our walkthrough of Wright Arrow for today. I will leave several charts of the stock on my Twitter page for your reference for you to review. I could have broken this down even more, but I think it would have been a little too tedious if I went through all of the relevant news and articles related to aviation and to Wright Arrow on a day-by-day basis. But I think that this should be sufficient enough for you to get a sense of what was going on at the time that Wright Arrow was making its moves and why it was such an obvious stock to trade. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.